Welcome, everybody. We're excited today to do this on-demand webinar to talk about NIS2. Now, if you aren't tracking, which most people aren't tracking right now, NIS2 is a new directive that has come out of the EU that I think is going to really change the world when it comes to cybersecurity governance and enforcement. And if you're a global company, especially if you're a U.S. company that also does business in the EU, how you're expected to achieve compliance with NIS2. And hopefully we'll cover today how you can integrate NIS2 into your existing security program so you can evidence compliance, but hopefully keep the burden on your company low in terms of net new activities that you might need to do. So before we get started, let me do a quick intro so you know who you're talking to here. So my name is Christian Hyatt. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Risk360. I'll talk a little bit about what Risk360 does quickly. But suffice it to say, Phil and we've been partners in crime here for the last 5-6 years, digesting the different regulatory things that come out of the EU, like GDPR when that came out. Now the NIS2 Directive DOR that we'll be talking about shortly. So we have a long history of thinking about the different directives and the different frameworks and then trying to make those actionable to the audience. Phil, you want to do a quick intro of yourself?
Sure. So like Christian mentioned, I'm director at Risk360. I've been here for a while helping companies interpret and comply with new regulations. So we're excited to tackle NIS2 today.
Yes, we actually read through the entire directive, and we'll provide that markup as part of the downloadables for this video. But we're really excited to talk about that. Let me give you a little bit of context. I'll go over this really quickly. Just who is Risk360? The bottom line on Risk360 is what we do is we help organizations that have a really complex security and compliance environment. That usually means they have to comply with multiple security and compliance frameworks and privacy frameworks. They have multiple business units and multiple products. And it just becomes really, really burdensome to manage those different requirements. And there's always new requirements like NIS2 that enter the fold. And our specialty is really helping organizations implement a strategy to harmonize those frameworks, put them in a GRC platform, playbooks to run the program, consolidate the audits so the external audits are easy, build great risk management programs in the process, and build customer trust. So that's what our whole company does. And we do that through great people, playbooks to do it, and our GRC platform, Full Circle, that helps map and manage all of these different control frameworks that we might talk about a little bit. But that's why we care about all these emerging frameworks, and we try to produce thought leadership to help. So that's a little bit of background on us and our expertise. Just real quick, as we dive into the agenda, here's what we're going to get into today. So number one, I want to give everyone some context on NIS2, how we got here, the history, put it in context so you know how to interpret it. I want to talk about applicability. Phil did some good research on who exactly is this applicable to. There's literally tens of thousands of companies right now that this is applicable to. And there's also, importantly, some that it's not applicable to, so you need to be thinking through that. We want to talk through the NIS2 directive itself. The directive is a piece of legislation that's being pushed down to, I guess, the member states in the EU. So we'll talk about the structure of that directive and some of the explicit requirements. Then we're going to talk about how you can actually become compliant. How do you integrate this into your existing security compliance program? So we'll give you the implementation glide path. And we want to talk about how you can prove compliance and some of the requirements around reporting compliance. And then we'll wrap up just making sure that you're aware of some of the free resources that we've made available, including the detailed markup of the directive itself with our comments, trying to make it human readable. An executive summary, if you want to communicate this to the board. We'll have this video itself available and hopefully a checklist as well if you want to just kind of perform a sanity check and see how close to compliance you are with the NIS2 directive. So that's what we'll cover today. Hope there's a lot of value. So let me kick it off here with talking about how we got here and where we are today. So as of recording this, it's August of 2024. So we're kind of in the midst of this directive being rolled out. And how it works in the EU is that the EU itself will issue a directive. And then the directive will go down to the member states, and the member states have an opportunity to interpret that directive and decide how they are going to implement it themselves. So the EU directive has been published, and right now the deadline for the different member states are the countries like Germany and others, they have until October to respond to that directive and say and communicate what they're going to do as a country to comply with that directive. That creates a unique situation where different member states have a little bit of flexibility with how they intend to, mandate that directive, how they intend to implement it, the different tools that they'll do, the enforcement mechanisms. And just historically, what we've seen is the EU will release a directive. It'll go down to member states. It's almost every directive is fairly controversial. There'll be different opinions on how it should be implemented. And then the different member states will kind of rally around somewhat of a baseline, some common implementation plan, largely driven by the biggest economies in the EU that will have the biggest say. So that's where we're at right now. We're kind of waiting for the member state interpretation. We know that this is going to be big. We know that this is a new level of governance. This will, most importantly, I think that this directive is the EU making clear their philosophy on how they plan to govern cybersecurity in the future. They're forming new bodies. There's new levels of enforcement, new and clear requirements, and some things that are really interesting, like the ability to perform scans on internet-facing IP addresses of public companies. That's a net new type of thing. And now we're in the member state interpretation and adoption phase, which will go through to at least October. It'll likely extend way beyond that because we're already hearing that some of the EU member states do not feel like they're going to be able to meet that deadline. Then once we get clarity at the member state, ultimately your company is going to have to comply with the different member states in which you operate and if you operate in the EU. So that is a little bit, that's a quick overview of where we're at in terms of context. And now we're going to dive a little bit into the directive itself. Phil, anything you want to add on context or how we got here?
I think it's really a through line on NIS2 is really understanding that the EU is concerned about its critical infrastructure. So that's something it's a little more visceral than maybe something like privacy. So that's the focus, and that's really a good framework if you're trying to deal with it, is really thinking about what you're doing that relates to critical infrastructure, and it affects how you look at whatever services you're providing, and the lens you undertake your activities through.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So you have some of the context. Now a good first question that you might want to ask is NIS2 even applicable to me? Phil, can you maybe give a quick overview? How should companies be thinking about applicability, and if they should even be paying attention to this directive?
Yeah, so there are two different categories that are called out, throughout the directive. The first is essential entities. They're all listed on screen. I think our audience might be most interested in the fact that digital infrastructure is also included there. So it includes like very critical web infrastructure like DNS providers, top-level domains, but also cloud providers, maybe some SaaS providers are also going to be in scope.
Yep.
So that's the first category, essential entities.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We mostly deal with B2B technology companies, which means they're usually doing something important. They're probably have a SaaS product. A lot of cloud infrastructure providers or supporting providers, even MSPs. So this is going to have wide-reaching impact. I just talked to a colleague in Germany, and he said that there's 30,000 companies just in Germany that this will be applicable to. So that means there's likely hundreds of thousands of companies globally that will be impacted by this. So in all likelihood, this is going to be applicable to you in one way. So that's essential. Can you talk a little about important entities?
Yeah, important entities is the other kind of class of companies that are subject to the directive. So they're listed on the screen. Other types of essential infrastructure. We'll talk a bit later about the difference in how the directive applies between essential versus important entities. But those are the principal classifications you'll
Yep.
find.
And I know we're going to get to it. Just as people are thinking through this, I don't think there's going to be a lot of guesswork as to whether or not you're applicable or not, because one of the requirements of the NIS2 directive is each member state is going to have to create a registration process. It'll likely be a website or something where your company has to go and submit certain types of information, like your name, what you do, your IP ranges, which is a little controversial. And you will literally be on a registration. So whether or not you're on that list should be fairly clear in theory. You're either on the list or you're not on the list. And in all likelihood, if your company has any scale and you're working in technology or critical infrastructure, you will be on the list ultimately. But again, member states are going to be pushing that out soon. Hopefully by October, we have some details there. Let's dive into NIS2 structure a little bit. And I think for anyone who's never read a directive from the EU, I think one thing that is helpful is the directives are kind of broken up commonly in kind of I would say the first part of their directives are always explaining why the directive exists and some of the authority they have to issue the directive and some of the expectations of member states. And then as you get into the different chapters, sometimes they lay out scope or applicability or maybe some specific requirements. In this example, the specific cybersecurity requirements. And then there's often annexes that break out in more and more detail. So that's just the structure of the directives typically is high-level overview, and then it narrows down into more and more specificity. And then if you want to get the most level of specificity, you typically have to read the member state responses to these directives on exactly how they're going to make it apply. But for right now, we're just covering through what does that directive say? What does the directive say exactly? And if you are really want to nerd out on this, download the directive itself with our markup that we're making available through this. And you can go through and we've highlighted things and inserted comments for interesting points that we think. So hopefully that's a helpful resource. So let's dive right into the NIS2 structure, Phil, if you don't mind.
Sure. So like Christian mentioned, the recitals is the first portion of the directive. So we've highlighted just a couple areas here that you might want to focus on if you're taking a very quick read through it. You'll find some additional ones in the markup that we're going to provide. But the recitals, like Christian mentioned, they vary a lot in exactly what each one is trying to achieve, but you'll find a little bit of guidance on like why a certain concept in the directive exists, the goal that the EU was hoping to achieve with that. It's worth a read as much time as you have because it'll provide you a lot of the broader context as you go through the rest of the directive. So getting into the actual text, it's divided into chapters. The first chapter, general provisions, you'll definitely want to read that one because that has a long list of definitions, clarifies who's applicable, the basic context around the regulation and the directive and who needs to deal with it. From there, you'll see, honestly, a lot of the directive deals with establishing this big EU infrastructure to provide supervision and regulation, coordinated information sharing, incident response. There is a lot of broader EU infrastructure that's supposed to be created as described in the directive.
Yeah,
So
that's one of
really,
the most fascinating things for
yeah.
me, Phil, is like I really think everyone should browse this a little bit because you're getting inside the head of the regulators of the EU, like their vision for what this thing should look like. For example, every member state is supposed to stand up a CCERT, which is like their own incident response command center. They'll have rights like the ability to scan public-facing IP addresses. They will have responsibilities like enforcement. You're supposed to submit incidents to this body, which they're permitted to investigate. They can even do things like gather information on private citizens and even in some cases share that with third parties as part of their investigation. So that stuff is just extremely interesting to me because that is their philosophy on what they deem appropriate and necessary to govern cybersecurity and share the risk amongst all the different companies and member states. So right, wrong, or indifferent, whether you like that approach or you don't like that approach, it is just very interesting to see where their head's at in terms of governing cybersecurity.
Absolutely. So continuing, so Chapter 4 we'll cover on the next slide. That's where you'll actually find the cybersecurity requirements. Most of the articles you'll see here are additional infrastructure. So Chapter 5 will cover the registration requirements that we keep referring to. Chapter 6, information sharing. We'll see how member states provide for it, but it's encouraging like coordinated threat intelligence sharing between in-scope entities and their supervisory authorities. Chapter 7, of course, will get into your fines, how it's going to be enforced. And then Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 are really administrative portions covering the requirement for member states to put this into their own law, other acts that might need to be created to enable the directive to be fully enforced. But yeah, again, a lot of infrastructure that needs to be created on everything you'll see here.
Yeah, and so if I'm a chief risk officer, I'm the head of legal, I'm a CISO watching this right now, and you're thinking about how to integrate NIS2 into your existing program, I think the key takeaways are this directive, one, lays out the philosophy, why they're doing this, why they believe it's necessary. Two, it lays out the requirements of the different member states, things that you care about most if you're watching this is how do you register? Is it applicable to you? So applicability plus literally going to the member state's website and registering your company with them. The explicit cybersecurity requirements, which we're going to talk about next, that the directive lays out, and also enforcement. Like, what's your risk when it comes to enforcement, potential fines? If you have an incident, how do you have to cooperate with the member states? What's that burden going to look like for you? And this really begins to lay that out. Next step is reading the member state implementation guidance on how they plan to do that. But this is what we have so far. So next, let's go ahead and dive into some of the key requirements when it comes to cybersecurity. Like, what do you actually have to do? And spoiler alert, a lot of this is going to sound very familiar with your existing security program, with a couple of nuances that we'll pull out when we talk about implementing and improving compliance. So Phil, want to run through just some of the high-level cybersecurity requirements?
Yeah. So at its heart, this is about risk management. So you'll see Article 20 requires top management to oversee cybersecurity risk. That'll sound very familiar for our companies out there who have ISO-based programs. Of course, risk management really throughout any kind of security regulation or framework. So similar requirement here. And then Article 21 lays out key categories where you need to implement what they call proportional measures. Those are just your controls in all of these listed areas that adequately address your risk. Article 23 will get into incident reporting. So it's actually, if you're thinking GDPR, the famous language is without undue delay. NIS is actually a little more specific. It says you need to notify your CCERT within 24 hours. Of course, the notification won't be complete, but you need to give them something within 24 hours of becoming aware. And then a 72-hour requirement for more detailed reporting.
Yep. I think a thing I want to point out here too, there's a lot of words here. If you look at Article 21, cyber risk management measures, I'll read some of them out. Security policy, incident handling, business continuity, supply chain security, security and system acquisition and development, so on and so forth. Those requirements should sound very familiar. Whether you're a US-based company that is aligning to something like NIST 853, even if you have a SOC 2 program, or if you're aligning to ISO 27001 or similar, no matter almost any framework that you're doing, the takeaway here is, wow, this is really in alignment to any set of baseline best practices. And we'll talk about implementation in a second, but you're probably not going to do much net new. It's just an awareness of what these requirements, what NIS2 is requiring, and then how to articulate how you're in alignment with that, with one nuance around risk assessment that I'll point out in just a second. I do think it's important for us to talk about what we don't know yet, because there is a lot in flight right now. Like I said, member states are still interpreting this whole thing. So some key things that I'm just curious about by reading the words is the pushback from the member states. I suspect this is going to be controversial, that the different member states are going to interpret it one way or another. There's some states that are going to want to be very strict, some member states that are going to want to be very loose on this. And we'll just see where it lands. A lot of this is totally up to the member states. A good example is like, how will you submit incidents? How will you register with the state? How likely is the state to try to regulate against you? Some of these things are just unknowns. We don't know how they're going to maintain the list yet. It'll probably be a website. That's kind of what they're describing in the NIS2 directive as a recommendation. Interesting to me is the NIS2 directive says that member states have to pay for it. They have to finance it, but they don't define how they're going to finance it. Speculatively, it's through taxes, but there could be other innovative financing mechanisms, I guess, that member states could use to finance it. And it will have to be financed, because to stand up this infrastructure is going to require employees, it's going to require technology, it's going to require enforcement and investigation. So we'll see how all that goes. NIS2 also requires all the member states to produce templates, websites, available tools, self-assessment tools, registration templates. None of that has been released yet. So we don't know how light or heavy that will be so far. And we also do not have incident reporting procedures. So what we do know is that there's a NIS2 directive coming. It will require you to have a minimum baseline of cybersecurity. You will be required to register and cooperate with your states. There will be enforcement, and you will have to tell them about incidents if you have them. What we don't know is the tactical implementation of all of that. So that's just where we're at. Anything you think we should add, Phil, on what we don't know?
No, a lot really depends on how quickly member states get their guidance out.
Awesome. Good stuff. So now let's get to the implementation piece of it. So what do you need to do? What should you be thinking about today to comply with NIS2? And I think that no matter how early we are in this process, I think there's some meaningful things to think about right away when it comes to NIS2 compliance. So we'll give you our thinking and our playbook on it. So kind of our assumption walking into this is you already have a global compliance program. You're probably already compliant or aligned with multiple frameworks, NIS2 being a new one, but probably already doing SOC 2, GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, NIST, ISO 27001. You probably already have thousands of controls and thousands of pieces of audit artifacts, and you're being audited and you're achieving certifications. And all these new requirements are costly and burdensome. And you need to be able to prove compliance to your customers, your regulators, and your stakeholders, but you just don't want to add more burden and friction to your program. So the solution when it comes to proving NIS2 compliance that we're about to recommend is assuming this is you, this is your life. This probably sounds familiar. And what you want to do is you want to build something that's scalable and efficient, it's repeatable, it's harmonized into your existing security compliance program, and it's also evidenceable. You can prove it to your customers. So just know this is the context that we're walking in. This is part of our playbook. So if this doesn't sound like you, what we're about to say might not make sense, but if this is resonating, stay tuned. This is how we think you should walk through it. I think what you want to do, our solution is you want to build a great risk management program. So you do want to cover yourself when it comes to cyber risk. You want a defensible approach. You want to do the right things, but also you have to keep it efficient. You have to keep your costs and efforts low, help your company achieve profitability. You can't add a bunch of heads to accomplish this. You don't want yet another audit to track. And you do want to keep stakeholders informed and trust. Your customers are going to be asking about this. Regulators are going to be asking about this. Your board, your internal executive team is all going to be asking about this. So you need to have their trust. So that's what we think the challenges are. This is what we think the desired outcomes are. And here is what we think you can do about it. This is kind of what we're coaching clients to do to achieve NIS2 compliance. So the first thing we think, there is a nuance, and I've kind of alluded to this a couple times. So NIS2 does provide some baseline cybersecurity requirements. So some things that they think everyone should be doing, but it says very clearly in the NIS2 directive that that is a baseline, and you're probably going to have to do more or different things based on your own unique risks. So that suddenly places a huge premium on doing great risk assessments, because what we think you're going to have to do is do a risk assessment, and then based on your own risk assessment, be very clear on why you made the decisions to build the program the way you have chosen to build it, because you're going to have unique products, you're going to have unique services. There's just so much nuance into how you need to build your own security program that the EU is going to take that into consideration when they're thinking about how to regulate you. So doing the baseline is not enough for most of you companies. Most of you have to do a risk assessment, formally define your approach, and build a defensible approach. That's not new, but I think the level of documentation to have the quote unquote defensible approach might be a little higher than it used to. So as you make decisions, you need to be thoughtful and formal about articulating why you made that decision, which risk you're accepting, which risk you're treating, and so on and so forth. So it all starts there. It's like, let me do a risk assessment, figure out what we should be doing, and be able to defend that approach. Once you do that, I think the second step is going to be integrating that and harmonizing it into your existing compliance framework. So whether you're ISO, NIS, SOC 2, doing all of that, harmonize it and shore it up within your existing program, because you're probably already doing 90% of what you need to do. Maybe there's a small delta on things you can close the gap. And that's when you're going to implement those new mechanisms. So common gaps might be maybe your policies are a little light. Maybe you don't have the process to really submit those incidents in that 24-hour period, or resolve incidents with more detailed documentation in 72 hours. Maybe there's even other known gaps in your program that you just need to track down and remediate. Or often, maybe there are unknown gaps that you don't even know. So you have to start with a gap assessment, inventory those gaps, and then figure out a plan to close those gaps. And to me, that is all about, the risk assessment is about thinking through, do you have a defensible approach? What would a defensible approach look like? Whereas the implementing the new elements is all about establishing and codifying your defensible approach and implementing those elements. And once you've implemented those elements, you need to operationalize those key work streams, like your governance, your risk management program, incident management, business continuity, and so on and so forth. And this whole process is going to be very iterative. So at a very high level, this is the process that we're taking all of our clients through to integrate NIS2 into their existing compliance program and build that defensible approach. And then there's a few unique deliverables that I'm suggesting that clients consider when it comes to proving to stakeholders or even potentially regulators or customers that you are in fact compliant with NIS2, because today there's no like NIS2 certification. You have to demonstrate compliance in a different way. So first of all, thinking through who you need to demonstrate compliance to. I think it's your board of directors, it's because your executive team, they're concerned about this. Certainly the regulators themselves. If you were to be sued and you had potential litigation, I think that you would have to defend yourself in a court of law, perhaps. So that would be necessary. And I also think that revenue's on the line. We're already seeing customers and prospects of our customers ask about NIS2 compliance to get comfortable doing business with them. So just like you're getting an ISO certification or a SOC 2 or whatever to prove customer trust, I think your customers are going to start putting NIS2 language and addendum in contracts themselves, as well as during the procurement process. You're probably going to have to answer questions around NIS2, specifically because a big part of NIS2 is supply chain risk. So I expect the classic questionnaires and contractual requirements to flow down and impact your organization. So those are the stakeholders I think we're speaking to. And now it's, how do you demonstrate compliance? So a few things that I think we should do is, one, get a lot better at documenting risk assessments, especially maybe even in an approved NIS2 format for your organization, to document your risk, what you plan to do about those risks, your treatment plans, and then your formalized approach. I think that's going to be your defensible approach document, doing a really good document of risk assessments. The second thing I think you're going to need to document is evidence of program operating effectiveness. So you need to start thinking about continuous controls monitoring. That might be ongoing internal audits or even automations that you can build out. You're going to have to formalize that internal audit program, doing regular ongoing internal audits of your program at least annually, but maybe more often depending on your organization's size and shape. I think you should keep doing those external audits and certifications. Those are pieces of paper from an internal independent third party that I think adds some credibility to your program. Keep doing penetration testing or red teaming or continuous pen testing exercises. I think anytime a third party is looking at your program, identifying risk, and then you're proving maturity that you're closing those gaps, that builds a really strong defensible case for your organization. And I think you should continue doing BCP, DR, and incident response testing and documenting that test, not just doing it, but actually documenting formally those testing. And those are just a few of the examples of ongoing operative effectiveness, and there are many others that you should do. And then the last thing I think would make a lot of sense, and we're doing this with a couple clients right now, is building some kind of what we're calling the NIS2 transparency report. So it could be an internal marketing document or even an assessment from a third party that articulates in very clear language what you are doing to meet the NIS2 compliance requirements. Again, this isn't a certification because there is no certification for NIS2, at least not right now. But I think being able to clearly state to a stakeholder, hey, this is our approach to NIS2, here's how we feel confident that we're compliant, and putting that in a nice document that someone can read as an executive summary, it is very powerful. So those are a few things I think you should do and be considering that we're already coaching clients to do when it comes to demonstrating NIS2 compliance. Phil, anything you want to add about proving compliance out?
I do think around the risk assessment, it's helpful, again, to consider the context around NIS2. So a risk assessment is typically about what effects to the organization of a particular risk materializing. Thinking about you have a process related to EU critical infrastructure, or you're providing a service that relates to critical infrastructure. It gives you a different lens for looking at risk and assessing risk, and ultimately applying those measures beyond the baseline to provide the level of security that is the goal here.
Yeah, absolutely. So in summary, that's kind of our plan. That's our playbook. That's what we think you should do. I do want to let you know about a couple free and important downloads and just tools that are available to you already. So number one is our markup of the NIS2 directive itself. We've went ahead and put this into a Word document. We've combed through the entire directive, highlighted areas that we think are interesting, tried to call your attention through comments to something that might be important to you. And I would advise read the directive and then use our comments as commentary and additional guidance on things that caught our eye. To me, that's a lot more interesting than just reading the directive. You kind of get me and Phil sitting by your side and calling some things out. So we will make this available for download. The other thing I want to show you guys real quick is, because I know we have a lot of customers watching this, is inside our platform, Full Circle, the way that we're actually addressing the NIS2 directive. So let me share that real quick with you as well. I think it's really exciting. So Full Circle, again, if you're not familiar with that platform, that's our GRC platform. Is how we manage our programs, or our customers manage their programs if you're doing ISO, SOC, or whatever it is you might be doing. So let me show you what that looks like. I think when it comes to managing a program, a lot of folks are doing it in Excel right now, and then you get this huge, this whole, I guess, Frankenstein's monster spreadsheet of different compliance frameworks, and they're all mapped together, and you can't really add anything to it easily. So what you're looking at right now is Full Circle. This is our controls management platform. So if you were to go to a dashboard, you can see that there are lots of different frameworks that you can align to. There's different controls that you can align to. If you click in the controls tab, these are our controls. Right now we have them mapped across ISO, SOC 2, and PCI, but you can add other frameworks as you would like. And one of the things that we're doing with customers who have already harmonized their frameworks across multiple frameworks is adding this too, and the specific directive requirements as either a tag or as a framework, so that as you go through and do reporting, you can do that pretty quickly. So for example, controls operating status. Are your controls operating? Well, you could go in there, sort by your tag for NIS2 and get a percentage of progress towards operating status, where are your gaps, which ones need review, and so on and so forth. So this is a really powerful tool for you to do a couple things. One is to decide which controls are applicable, so you don't have to add yet another framework. You can just easily map it into your existing control framework. Number two is managing those controls. So going through and gathering the audit evidence as you do your internal audits, marking operational effectiveness, marking gaps that you want to track down and close. And number three is the reporting. If you need to report to regulators, customers, or the board of directors, there's some really powerful reporting opportunities in here for you to demonstrate that. So I just wanted to show you guys that if you're an existing customer and you're thinking about integrating NIS2, or if you're not yet a RIS 360 customer, we'd love to talk to you about our whole implementation roadmap, as well as how we're using Full Circle to accomplish that. Let me flash one more time the downloadables on here. We will make sure that we include the link to get all of these resources, the executive summary, the directive itself marked up, and a copy of this video if you would like to see it, all in the link. And if you click on that link into your information, you can download all of that stuff right away, and we hope it's super valuable. If you want to have a conversation about this a little bit more, reach out to me, Christian Hyatt. If you look me up on LinkedIn, connect with me, send me a message. I'll be happy to chat with you about it. Or you can email me at christian.hyatt@risk360.com, and I'd be happy to help. You can do the same thing for Phil Brudney, same format. So we appreciate you guys watching today. We hope that this helped alleviate some anxiety and give you some direction on how to interpret NIS2. And thank you for watching.